Hello, I'm Russell Sturgis, the founder and principal of the Centre for Western Mindfulness. Thank you for joining us in the next in the series of blogs that I've been doing on forgiveness. Today I'm talking about the concept of forgiveness as a habit, or it's sort of the fallback that we habitually go to when presented with opportunities to have to practice forgiveness, as opposed to something where we've got to apply a very conscious cognitive process and maybe discipline in order to apply forgiveness. When thinking about this and preparing for this, I was very aware that I needed to explore some of the ancient religious traditions in order for us to gain a better appreciation of forgiveness as a way of life. It was something that was intrinsic to Buddha's teachings, and it was something that was intrinsic to Jesus's teachings. And I want to use both of them to help give some insight into the concept of forgiveness as a way of life. Let's start with the Buddhist approach. Buddha taught four noble truths, and most of what I'm going to be talking about in terms of the Buddhist approach is a Western interpretation, and probably more specifically my interpretation of the core meaning of these as it relates to how we would think about it in the West. So the four noble truths were, number one, we all suffer. That was noble truth number one. Noble truth number two, we suffer because of what we're attached to. Number three, we can be free of suffering. And number four, we can do that now, particularly if we follow the noble eightfold path to enlightenment. So Buddha had these 8 steps that were necessary for you to be free of suffering, which would result in enlightenment. And so at one end of the continuum you have suffering, at the other end of the continuum you have enlightenment. Forgiveness was one of those steps. Now, he also taught that there were 3 things that got in the way of people being able to engage the Noble Eightfold Path to Enlightenment, and he called them the 3 poisons. And once again, I'm going to give you my Western version of these. The first one was ignorance, when you don't know that you don't know. And so it's when you keep on doing what you've always done, and invariably, those things result in suffering. And of course, when you don't know any different, you keep on doing them, or you find ways of avoiding the pain, which may be through drugs, either medicinal or recreational, or addictions, or all sorts of other things. The second poison was avoidance. Now, you're no longer ignorant in this place. You've been given the information of what you need to do in order to be free of suffering. But it's that no. It's that whole thing of, no, it's all too hard for me to make the effort to change my the way I think, the way I feel, the way I behave, what it is that I desire. It's too much effort to do all of that, and I'll put up with my suffering as long as I can. The third one is when we're in a place of attachment, and that's also like avoidance. We've got knowledge about what we need to do in order to change things, but we actually say, yeah, I want to have it be different, and we use discipline and willpower to change our behaviour in order for us to experience something different. And invariably we do experience something different in the place of attachment, but something can happen that is painful or creates some challenge for us, and we revert back to our old habitual ways of functioning because it comes easy. We don't have to think about it. We don't have to put discipline or willpower into it when we're dealing with some sort of issue that's arisen. We need an easy option out, and so those people who have been dieters, you've been on a diet, you've lost the weight, you're looking good, you're feeling great, something happens and you find yourself reverting to your old eating habits. And in many occasions, people not only put the weight on that they lost, but they put more on. And that's not uncommon with a whole lot of, that's just dieting, but there's a whole lot of other ways that people need to be making more self-loving choices where they attempt to through discipline and willpower, but can't sustain it. Now, those three poisons were referred to by Jesus in the parable of the sower in the Sermon on the Mount, where he talked about the seeds that fall amongst the weeds, for example, and the seeds that fall in the rocks or the seeds that are on the seal soil. If we put those in the same order as Buddha, so ignorance is seeds falling on soil that hasn't been worked, so the seeds just lay on the top of the ground. So that's like seeds are new knowledge. And so in the case of ignorance, the seeds can't get in under the surface, and that's the state of ignorance. The avoidance is the seeds are able to get through the surface, but the roots can't get established because of the blocks that are there, and the blocks are the rocks. These are the stones that basically interfere with the roots getting established. And then the third one is the seeds that fall amongst the weeds. And so the seeds are planted, the roots take place, but this is where the old habits, which are the weeds, take over and choke the new seeds or the new plants, the new seedlings, and destroy them. So Jesus was sort of using a farming analogy to teach exactly the same things in terms of the three poisons. Now, he didn't have a noble eightfold path to enlightenment, but what he did have was the Beatitudes, which are in the Sermon on the Mount. And the Beatitudes was a series of 8 statements that once again, when looked at more closely, give us some really clear understanding of what's required to have forgiveness become a sustainable way of life. And there's a few things that you've got to go through first in order for forgiveness to become a habit. And I want to share what it was that he was teaching as it relates to this whole concept of a Western approach to mindfulness as opposed to an Eastern approach. I mean, it's interesting to see the parallels between what Buddha was teaching and Jesus was teaching. There's some similarities here, but there are some differences. And I think that the Beatitudes are a much more simplified approach. So the first Beatitude says, blessed are the poor in spirit. And that's the experience that we have in a place of suffering. Spirit is about our capacity to pursue what we desire, to have motivation. And poor in spirit is when spirit's been broken. And that's the result generally of suffering, is when our spirit's been broken. So what was being taught here is the notion that this is actually a blessing. This is a good thing. Because what we're now finding out is where our state of ignorance is. Remember, mindfulness is the point where you remember that you have a choice. And in a state of ignorance, there is no choice because you're doing what you've always done. So here we have this situation where suffering is actually, in fact, something that wakes us up to the idea that we're doing things that aren't serving us. Now, the next 2 Beatitudes are about developing new knowledge or awareness. And the first one of these is mourning. Now, mourning is when we can step outside of our suffering and be the observer of it. So it's one thing to be in your suffering and be overwhelmed by it. It's another thing to have suffering. It's not about denying it, but it's about stepping outside of it and becoming the observer. So this is new awareness. All of a sudden, we're aware that our suffering is a consequence of certain behaviours, which we weren't aware of when we were in our state of ignorance. The third Beatitude says, blessed are the meek. So in this place we go, hang on a second, I don't know anything. I've lived my whole life doing this. This is what it's resulted in. I can now see that that's what's going on, but I actually don't have any knowledge about how to do this differently because I've been in a state of ignorance. And so this third one, blessed are the meek, really aligns with that whole notion of when the student is ready, the teacher appears. And so in this place, you might find a book, or you might see a video on YouTube, or you might watch a documentary, or you might go to a workshop or a seminar. But in other words, you're in a position where you're now gathering new knowledge and consequently new awareness. And of course, what does that mean? It means that you're now in the position to have a choice. So in other words, you've got your ignorant way of functioning. Suffering's woken you up to the fact that maybe I need to look at doing this differently. You've now gathered new knowledge. And so you're in this position where the fourth beatitude says, blessed are those who hunger and thirst after righteousness. And so this righteousness is about kindness. That's the easiest way of describing it. And so this is about going, oh, maybe I could develop a passion or a keen sense of wanting to be more aligned with what's kind to myself, kind to others, and kind to the planet. And so this is about saying, do you know what? I'm going to start being mindful of the choice. That's hungering and thirst after righteousness. It's like I'm going to now practice in every time I become discombobulated, every time I'm in a place of suffering, I'm going to stop and consider what the alternative is, that I have a loving choice. Okay, and so now you're in this place where you're constantly considering that there's a loving alternative or a kinder choice, which is the righteousness for myself, for others, and for the planet. Which brings us to the fifth beatitude, which is blessed are the merciful. And so what happens is that in terms of now sustaining peace and love and joy as a way of life, which is the result of staying mindfulness of loving alternatives or kind alternatives, we actually have to institute forgiveness or mercy as a way of life in order to have that be sustainable. And so what happens at this point in the journey, once you've done all of that other stuff, now you can start to practice forgiveness and mercy as a way of life. And it becomes easy because now you desire what the loving alternative is that you learnt about when you were in your place of being teachable. And so now you want peace and joy and love as a way of life instead of suffering. And now you understand what it's going to take. And a big part of that is the element of forgiveness. This is all of these things that were being taught in these first four Beatitudes are the precursors that are necessary for you establishing forgiveness as a habit, as a healthy habit. Because if peace is your priority, then forgiveness is your only function. And so you're actually in this place where now you're saying, this is what I want, and this is how I want to continually turn up in the world. And this is the way that you're able to make forgiveness a habit. Please have a read of the written blog because it'll actually give you some more insight into this. But forgiveness as a way of life is a reality, and forgiveness as a way of life is what can create the ability to replace suffering with peace. If you want to know more about the Centre for Western Mindfulness, check out our Facebook page. You might also like to have a look at our website. And I look forward to catching up with you again next month. Bye.